Oh, you jumped ahead. You're an overachiever. Okay, I get it. All right, let's back up and make sure everybody's on the same sheet of music here. And that's it. You're talking good stuff here because I'm going to go into that. Huh? Best, we were on number 4. That was 50-50 mix for antifreeze. On an engine with a timing belt, how would you determine whether or not the camshaft and crankshaft are mechanically out of time? What I always like to do, this is what I like to do, guys. This is Richard's way of determining if an engine is in time or out of time. To begin with, you're going to find out where the timing marks are for the camshaft. Now, this is going to vary from engine to engine, but by and large, if you get the camshaft in time, the crank mark ought to be in time. However, if you turn the crank around where it's on 0, top dead center, number 1, the camshaft could be in one of 2 places, either 180 out and so if you get the camshaft right, the crank ought to be right. That's just all there is to it. If you get the camshaft right, the crank somewhere else, and you're done. You know, right? Yep. Something else you can do, if you spin it over, you can audibly check compression. If, ordinarily, like I told you before, an engine ought to go, hear it squeezing air. But if it's going, that's you're suspect. Now, I have seen cars that have the real low tension piston rings like the ones you guys are working with on your engines that you're building, and you guys are going to jump back on those engines today, right? And get the engine, start putting them, make sure all that stuff's together, and we'll show you how to put them. Anyway, you got to get that stuff done because we don't want it to drag out all summer. See, we want to be through with that by this time next week. We can. Got it. All right. Anyway, what you do is if somebody has like used car lots, they'll start them. Move them over to another place, shut them off. Start them, move it over to another place, and shut them off. And I always complain about our trainer cars. We crank them up, pull them in, do a little bit of electrical work on them, crank them up, pull them out. Eventually, we foul the plugs, right? Well, what they do is they foul the plugs and they keep trying to start it. And the gas is just spray it in there, and the plugs are wet, and the spark's running on the wet gas instead of jumping across the spark plug gap, and it washes down the cylinder walls. Now, on the old engines, like on an old 302 or 350 or something like that, when the cylinder walls get washed down, the engine's going real slow, like I was talking about yesterday. But on a low-tension piston ring engine, it just spins real free, like it ain't got no compression at all. And I'd go out there sometimes, they'd say, the used car lot, set this one on the hook, won't start, sound like a timing belt jump. And so I go over and I check, and it'd be dead in time. And then we go, so I pull the spark plug out, and I squirt a couple of squirts of oil down in the cylinders to oil the cylinder wall, and it starts squeezing compression, fire up. All you got to do is squirt a little oil down there. Now that will keep you from looking like a dummy when you sell a timing chain and you found out that all they had was dry cylinder walls. See what I'm saying? If you wash the cylinder walls down, the oil's gone out of there. When you're honing a cylinder, when you're going to that, those little scratches you're making with that hone, the little microscopic scratches, are supposed to have oil in them, and that helps the engine. I mean, you know what I'm saying? That oil's got to be somewhere. It's not just between 2 pieces of metal, at least on the cylinder walls, where them rings are scratching up and down. There's all oil in there. And these guys were asking good questions when they were putting the rings on that piston. They put the rings on a piston and it had to span it out kind of like that right there, They said, hey, these rings are too big. What's up with that? So they got to have tension so they can get me a cylinder wall. You're learning stuff that you didn't know before. And also, when me and Sean pulled the pistons out of that neon out there, we saw stacked ring gaps. And that sucker was from the factory like that, apparently. The ring gaps were stacked. See these ring gaps? They don't ever need to be stacked like that. They need to be 180 out. You got that? Remember that, because if you got them stacked, you're going to have a compression loss right there with that little, even though there's not much. You also, what you're supposed to do is take your rings and put them down in a cylinder without a piston and measure the gap between the ends of the rings. Because sometimes you'll have rings that don't have any gap. And when you got rings that ain't got no gap, and you put them on a piston, yeah, you'll get them in a cylinder. But whenever you crank it up, it'll get warm and it'll stop running because they swell up. I've known of that happening in a shop right over here. He said, crank it up, run 10 minutes, and quit. Let it cool off, crank up, and run 10 minutes, and quit. It just gets too tight and it gets to where it can't run anymore. You've got to have a little bit of ring gap, like thousandths of an inch or something like that. Okay, that's extremely important. We forgot to check that on the one you built, didn't we? Or did we? Did we check that? I couldn't remember if we did or not. Everything was a blur. All right. Chelsea built that motor in 2 days. All right. Which shaft drives the oil pump on an engine? No, excuse me. Gain access to the timing marks and or check compression. That's how you would check on that timing belt thing. Does the crankshaft turn faster than the camshaft? Oh, incidentally, on the timing belt thing, You also need to know if what you have is a free spinning engine and the non-interference, or if it's a freewheeler. And an engine, examples of an engine that wheel freely are Toyota engines with timing belts, Ford, like Escorts and stuff, most of them. The 1.8's not, the 1.9 is. And the Mitsubishis and the Kias, they typically like to bend valves. The Kia likes to snap heads off of valves when they start to hit the pistons, and they bounce around in there and they destroy the block, they destroy the pistons, they destroy the cylinder head, and you just got to put a motor in it. And there was one people that sent me a email through my website, and they had a Kia, and they said we went past the timing chain, the interval to change the timing belt, and what happened was it jumped time and it destroyed the engine, and now we got a choice of they still owed money on the car, and they had whoever it was wanting like some ridiculous amount of money to put an engine in it at the dealership, $8,000 or something like that. It was ridiculous. But they were in a mess because they jumped over the timing belt interval. And this is something you need to make sure that everybody knows. If it's somebody that you care about, get that timing belt changed when it's supposed to be changed, or you're going to be sorry later. And I'll tell you something else about timing belts and timing chains. If you got the old timing chains, they have a tendency to jump. The newer ones don't much. The belt is never going to pick a good time to jump. You can decide when that belt gets changed, or it can decide when it gets changed. And there was a cute little blonde-headed girl that come in here one day, and we did some work on her little Isuzu Rodeo or whatever it was. I can't remember what kind of vehicle it was. And you could hear the timing belt slapping the cover. And I says, I can get a timing belt for $40, and tomorrow we can put a timing belt on here, and it'll save you from a breakdown. And she was a real airhead. Yeah, and she said, okay. Well, she never came back to get it done. And about 2 months later, I saw her out there. And she came in here and she says, I should have listened to you. I said, what do you mean? She said, I was turning it up there at Walmart and my timing belt jumped, and it bent all my valves, and it cost me $1,500 to get it fixed. If I'd have listened to you, I'd have got it done for $40 and I'd have saved myself all that trouble. It never picks a good time. It's not going to pick. You may be on a trip. You may be halfway to Panama City. You may find yourself sitting on the side of the road down there. Not good. Does the crankshaft turn faster than the camshaft?
No. Oh, yeah, crankshaft, yeah.
Crankshaft turns twice as fast. Which shaft drives the oil pump on an engine?
Okay. Go ahead. Explain what you think.
On some engines, it's turned by the camshaft. On some, it's turned by the crankshaft. On some, it's turned by the timing belt.
And on some older vehicles, it's turned by the distributor.
Yeah. Well, the distributor is driven by the camshaft. Because the distributor and the camshaft turn the same speed. You know how they got the little gear going down by the camshaft, or they'll have the distributor on the end of the camshaft. But on some of them that don't even have a distributor, they got something that looks like the bottom of a distributor, and that thing will actually drive the oil pump. Now, what happens sometimes, now listen to this, those little things, if you ever walk up here and you can see, let's say that I have seen situations where an engine quit running and wouldn't start, and you could walk up and just look down in the engine compartment and instantly tell why that engine quit and what was going to be done to fix it, typically. And if that distributor or that little synchronizer that runs the cam, it looks like the bottom of the distributor, if that thing locks up internally and just refuses to turn, and they do that sometimes, it will actually stop and it'll bust the gears, and it'll, cause the engine to quit running. Like on them Jeeps, particularly if it's got a cam sensor in there. If the cam sensor quits working on those, it actually...
What usually causes a motor to lock up?
Well, that particular little shaft going through that housing locks up is what happens. And that locks that up because it's running dry, and it just gets its galls, and all of a sudden it welds itself together. And you can see the little hole down, you can see where it twisted a little bit. It tried to turn the whole thing, but it couldn't. And usually it'll bust the teeth off the camshaft. I've actually seen it where it just busted the distributor gear. But my brother had a 71 Thunderbird, one of those really nice ones with a 375 horsepower 429 in it. And he was about halfway through Clayhatchee one night, and his quit on him. And I went down there, and the distributor wasn't turning. And so I went and pulled the distributor out, and the gear was busted up. I looked down there with my flashlight, and the camshaft gear was busted up. So I had to pull the intake off, I had to pull the pan off, had to put the front of the motor off, had to replace the camshaft, had to replace the doggone distributor and all that kind of stuff, put all that mess back together. But
beside the road.
Huh?
All beside the road.
No, we dragged it back to the house. I put it in the shop and did it. But anyway, that was one of them. That was one of those things that was like, everything's all fine and you're eating your cornbread and you can rest for a while, and then all of a sudden there's lots of work that has to be done. Okay, if the bore, the cylinder diameter, is greater than the stroke, which is the travel of the piston, that engine is referred to as what? Okay, can you remember this? Can you remember this?
Yes.
If I've got a piston, a bore that's this big, and I got a stroke that's less than the bore, that's over square. That's over square. Hey there, soldier, where you been, bro? That's it. We got to send a mortar strike over to Wiki. All right, now then.
He's still in the army. You know he's still in the army.
Yeah.
What happened?
The drill instructor would get him up if he's still in the army.
What?
All right. Let's see this. If it's traveling farther than the bore, in other words, if the bore is smaller than the stroke, it's basically a underscore. So just remember that. Now how is piston end gap different from piston ring side gap? We have engine people in here. Somebody should know this. Shelby, don't turn into a skeleton for Chelsea. And don't let me call you Shelby anymore. Okay? Now right here, you see this?
I get called Chelsea, it doesn't matter.
Look, I'm going to show you this.
Don't call me, I don't care.
Watch this. Watch this. On this piston, when you put these rings down in the cylinder, right? And you put that ring in the cylinder and you get a feeler gauge and you measure from the tip of that ring to the other end of it, that's the end gap. Side gap is how much space there is between the ring and the land. In other words, if this land is wore out and it can waller, it's got too much side gap. End gap is here, and side gap is here. Got that? End gap, side gap, end gap, side gap. All right. You got that? Okay. All right. Now then, and we're going to give a little plug here. This right here for Wes Sexton, Owner Tech Spare Parts Racing. There's his card right there. All right. Okay. End gap is measured between the ends of the ring with a piston ring and a cylinder with no piston. Side gap is measured between the ring and the piston land with a ring on the piston. What is a torque to yield bolt?
How do you explain that? Because, it's like a torque bolt or something? Yeah.
Now, what a torque to yield bolt is actually a bolt that you tighten to a certain torque click, like on the old early 80s Escorts. You're going to always see a torque to yield bolt on aluminum cylinder heads. Yeah, well, they have to be there because it's got to squeeze it enough so that you don't blow a head gasket. All right, so what you do is you torque it to a certain torque, and then you go like 90 degrees following the same torque pattern, and you go another 90 degrees. You got it? You guys know what I'm saying here? Yep. So what you're doing is, what are you doing when you do that? This is a controlled amount of stretch. Those bolts are especially designed to stretch. If an engine has got torque to yield bolts in it, you're supposed to replace the head bolts every time you pull the heads off. You did not do that because why? Did you have torque to yield bolts on your Taurus? No. What were those heads made of? Cast iron. They were not aluminum, okay? All right. So it's got. Have y'all all done this? Have you done the torque to yield bolt thing? All right. You got that? What am I always telling you? What am I always preaching? Whenever you're putting an engine back together, and you guys all remember this, if you've got a bunch of fluid, oil, water, whatever, in the bottom of a cylinder head bolt hole,
Blow it out.
You better get it out of there. You better put some kind of little hose down in there and blow through that hose and get all that crap out of there and make sure that hole is dry. Because if you don't, you'll hydraulic lock. You can't compress fluids. That's what makes brakes work. Got that? All right. So you're going to hydraulic lock that bolt. And it's not going to. Now, Eddie had some guys down there in diesel. He's putting this great big V8 DT904 Cummins or whatever it was, big old stud of a diesel engine they were putting back together that he had on a stand down there. And they had fluid down in one of them holes. And when they went to tighten the bolt down, it stopped moving before it got against the head. And Eddie wasn't around, so they said, they're the diesel guys. He looks kind of like a diesel guy. Diesel guys are usually big. Well, anyway, they said we're going to go ahead and tighten this sucker on down. We're going to make it go. And so they tightened it down all right. And when you do that, something's got to give. And they busted the block on that motor, trying to tighten. Well, the bolt had all them threads, and it was a real tough bolt. But they actually they cracked the block because that fluid, put so much pressure on that block. And then with their cheater pipe, their big old, they cracked the block. And what'll also happen is what's worse than that, on an aluminum block, like on these Toyotas, if you've got some stuff trapped in there, it will begin to shear the threads. But you may get a good torque on it, but it didn't tighten down against the cylinder head. Even though it looked like it was tight enough, and then you blow a head gasket right there. I mean, this is extremely important. This is what you really need to pay attention to every time you're putting head bolts back in. You best be blowing them holes out before you put them bolts in there. Most of them don't even think about that. You know what I mean? I ran into it, early on. I built a 440 Chrysler engine one time and had an issue with something like that. What's the difference between CF classification motor oil and SF classification? Huh? No clue. You will after I get through telling you. Anybody know? What does CF stand for? And most of the oil that we use in these motors out here, if you look at the thing on the tin, the little circle that's got your letters in it, that's going to have SF for spark fired and CF for compression fired. CF is only for diesels. And typically the basic rule of thumb is you can use CF oil in cars that require SF, but you can't go the other way. If you put SF oil in the diesel, has got a lot of blow-by, and the oil's not going to be able to handle the blow-by, the really contaminated really. CF classification is for compression-fired engines, SF for spark-fired engines. Always remember that. Okay, and somebody remind me, what does the W stand for in like 5W20? Winter. It does not stand for weight, it stands for winter. If you're checking a
I had an
vehicle...
old man argue with me about that.
Huh? Yeah. Well, people, when they've believed something all of their lives, then they're actually going to fight with you.
Look, no, he said, I'm older than you. I know what I'm talking about. I said, no, buddy, you don't. And Michael standing there, and he just stood back and let me handle it. He looked at Michael, he said, is he telling the truth?
Yeah, well, you can make somebody look silly, but you got to be. If somebody is that sure about what they're talking about,
I mean, I wasn't trying to make him.
Oh, of course not. Well, you were doing good. I mean, you did well.
What does the SF stand for?
Yeah, SF is spark fired, and CF is compression fired. You're checking a vehicle with an oil pressure gauge that reads 0 all the time. What do you do first?
Pull that oil cylinder out, pull one out.
Well, you're sort of right. Pull the engine. You're going to electrically check the operation of the gauge first. What I'm going to do is unplug the wire, ground it, see if the gauge goes to. If it does, then I'm going to pull that. I'm also listening to see if I hear lifters and whatnot. See what I'm saying? Or noise like we got low oil pressure. I'm going to put a gauge in there. I'm going to see what the pressure really is.